Capstone classes completely virtually over Google Classroom with no in-person meeting time whatsoever. And students were still able to keep up with their research and do everything that they needed to do. And you are going to see their amazingly brilliant projects tonight. And then this year has been equally exciting because I've had the privilege of teaching Introduction to Humanities, Humanities Seminar, Humanities PreCapstone, and Humanities Capstone, all 4 classes in the same 80-minute block with 4 totally different curriculums. And we have made it work. And quite honestly, I could not have done it without the super amazing students that we are celebrating tonight. I am so incredibly blessed and privileged to work with them. And I'm so grateful that you have all joined us tonight to see what they've been up to for the last 3 years in the case of our junior pre-capstone students and 4 years in the case of our senior capstone students. So just a little bit about the humanities. So the humanities can be described as the study of all the ways in which people try to record and understand the human experience by exploring things like philosophy, literature, language, art, and history. Students learn how to think creatively and critically, to reason and to ask questions. These skills allow students to gain new insights into the human experience, adding to their knowledge about our world. Through work in the humanities, students learn about the values of different cultures, about what goes into making a work of art, about how history is made. The coursework these students have pursued for the past several years has helped them better understand the world we live in and has hopefully given them even more tools to imagine a better future for us all. So tonight we are here to celebrate their scholarship. In terms of how the Humanities Academy operates, students who choose to enroll in our Humanities Academy complete all of the traditional Bangor High School graduation requirements while simultaneously completing an honors level and challenging, enriching sequence of courses and experiences that are designed to help students better understand the world and their place in it. Under our model, academically motivated and enthusiastic students are offered an extensive choice of programs and opportunities designed to help them understand the human story in all of its diversity. So tonight we are going to be paying tribute to their hard work, and we commend them for their excellent scholarship. Our progression of courses is designed to align course content over a 4-year sequence. And students progress through seminar-style courses and advanced curriculum in at least 2 out of the 3 key humanities departments: English, history, or world language. There are also extension activities like our partnership with the Metropolitan Opera that engage students in learning about the human experience, and then independent research that culminates in a final capstone project. In fact, if you look at how year 3 and year 4 is set up, you're going to find that students' capstone research is sort of set up along a little mini dissertation kind of process where they're completing research and lit reviews, developing conceptual frameworks, and then creating not only a pilot study, but also a full research project as well. And all of the research tonight takes an inquiry-based approach that is both interpretive and analytic. So because the human experience cannot be adequately captured by facts and figures alone, humanities research often poses questions about common assumptions, uncovers new meanings in artistic works, or finds new ways to understand cultural interactions. As a result, students' work in the pre-capstone and capstone years helps them think critically about the human experience and the world and their place in it, in the hope that they will discover better understandings of the past and in turn help us prepare for a better future. And I spoke at the beginning of the global challenges, so not only were students, working through a global pandemic and school shutdowns and completely virtual education last year, and then, mixed level classes this year. These students have really, to say that they've completed their projects in unprecedented and challenging times, I think is an understatement. Many of them have revised their plans, reconfigured ideas, gone back to the drawing board, but nevertheless, they have persevered, and I'm so happy to share this collection, which represents the culmination of their scholarship and dedication. So now I'm going to see if I can make this work and invite our first presenter to the stage, Evangeline Eastman. How?
Are you trying to go off the screen?
Yes. I'm really trying here, friends. I'm so sorry.
Okay. So, escape.
Okay. Oh, because it wouldn't do it while it was in present.
Right.
Thank you.
You go over, grab the top,
Yep.
pull it back.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay.
Stand right here in case you need me.
So that's good. And then now, with that, here we go.
And then just grab the top and push it over.
Okay. Like that. Oh, look at that. Oops.
And then,
I got to get it all the way.
Yep.
That is, sorry, friends.
oh,
Oh, but now what do I do? That? Here we go. Okay.
there you go.
Okay.
Can I
Yay.
just press the
Thank
arrows?
you. Yes, you should just be able to arrow right over.
Hi everyone. My name is Evangeline Eastman. I'm a PreCapstone Humanities student, and my project is called Why Can't Our Kids Read? A historically informed look at teaching literacy and inspiring a love for reading. I began my research by looking into some statistics about literacy levels in American elementary schools. What I found was very startling and concerning because the problem is actually a lot worse than I thought. This map shows by state the percentage of fourth grade students who cannot read at even the most basic level. If you look at states such as Alaska, New Mexico, and Louisiana, that number is very close to 50%. I developed a problem statement and some questions that would help me further guide my research. I wanted to know why some students were struggling while others excelled. I wanted to know how we can best teach literacy, and I wanted to know how I could help students enjoy reading. So I began my research by looking at some ineffective methods that have contributed to the problem. This first method is called Look-Say, and it was very popular throughout the 20th century, and it was used along with the Dick and Jane series of children's readers. This method teaches children to read words by memorizing their appearance, almost as if they were symbols or like, I don't know, hieroglyphs or something, instead of collections of letters. Additionally, I looked at cueing, which is a more modern method that is currently used all over the United States. This method is very harmful to student success because it teaches them many skills they can use to guess a word instead of actually how to read it. These are some of the skills on screen. Both of these methods are very ineffective and very harmful, especially when students reach older grades and they don't have things that can help them like illustrations or context clues. So what is the best method? I settled on phonics as definitely the most effective method. You all are probably very familiar with phonics. It's the method that teaches children that letters represent sounds and that they can put those sounds together to form words. This method is much more adaptable than those other methods, and it can withstand words that children don't know, words that aren't accompanied by illustrations, so it's just much more persistent throughout older grades. What was very concerning to me is that a lot of children across the United States don't have access to phonic curriculums, or they aren't taught enough phonics to combat the ineffectivity of the methods that they are taught. I developed a conceptual framework to help represent the main ideas of my argument. This graphic organizer here shows that phonics, comfort while reading, and interest in reading material are the three most essential things that help students learn to read. Additionally, I looked at some causes and effects of illiteracy. I learned that ineffective methods of teaching, time spent out of school, and feeling stressed or shameful while reading can make students more likely to struggle academically and struggle to become literate, which in turn heightens their risk of dropping out of high school, becoming involved in the criminal justice system, and earning less money as adults. So finally, I wanted to understand what I could do to help. This is my pilot project, which I will expand upon next year during my Capstone curriculum. First of all, I wanted to help parents navigate the whole craziness of preschool and helping their children learn to read. I wanted to help kids enjoy reading, and I wanted to explore the historical aspect of teaching literacy in addition to the language arts aspect. So first of all, I have so far drafted and planned a guide for parents, which would just go through a lot of different things that they might want to know about or be able to expect when their child begins their literacy education. So far, I have drafted this, but I don't want to finalize it until next year when I can consult with my mentors who are literacy specialists and teachers at K-3 schools. Additionally, I've developed a method for helping kids find books they love, which I hope to be able to implement in libraries or K-3 schools next year. So my method works off the main idea that to help kids love reading, we don't need to create a new interest out of nothing. We just need to harness the interest that they already have. And I thought, what better place to start than television shows? It might sound kind of silly, but I think that television shows are a really great way of seeing what kids already enjoy and what they already find interesting. So my plan works off the process of taking a TV show that a kid loves and taking out the main themes of that and finding books with those same themes. These are my sources, and thank you for your time.
I should have mentioned that in addition to their presentations, students have created research posters that will be on display in the library, and you'll have an opportunity to interact with the students, take a closer look at their research posters, and ask questions at the conclusion of all of the presentations. So thank you for that. Okay, we'll make this work. Nope, this way, that way. Okay. All right, next up, we have Elizabeth Speed. Yay. How's the, how, this way?
No, other way.
This way?
There you go.
Oh, yes, I was like, why is the arrow not going? I don't know. Do you have, well, this is not fun. I know, but this is, oh, let's do that. Okay, oops. Okay, hold on, we got this. That, no, this way, that way, okay. And then we're gonna go over here and to present. Yay! Take it away.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Speed, and I'm also my third year of the Humanities Academy. And for my capstone project, I've decided to research the relationship between culture and law. For my capstone project, I decided to research and examine the relationship between culture and law in different countries around the world. In conjunction, I've also researched how imperialism in the past affects the countries country's culture and legal system in the present. The information I've gathered will add to the Humanities Academy as it allows observers to become better global citizens and learn about other cultures around the world. For my essential questions that help me guide my research and keep me on track, they are as follows. What is the relationship between culture and law? And how does imperialism in history affect legal systems and culture in the present? Some steps I took for my project. This is the bulk of the information for my final project at the end. Keeping my essential questions on top in mind, I first chose the countries I thought were going to be good examples for my project. The countries I chose were Singapore, Norway, South Africa, and Tonga. Second, I found a connection between the two. I researched the culture and legal systems individually, and I found the connection myself. This is incredibly important to my project, as my project is finding the connection between law and culture. Third, I researched the past colonial powers of each country. I deliberately chose 2 countries I knew had colonial powers in the past, and 2 countries I knew that did not have any colonial powers in the past. Those were Singapore and South Africa had colonial powers, and Tonga and Norway did not. I did this to truly examine how imperial powers affect the countries and societies and to compare the difference between the 2. For my conceptual framework, I really wanted to focus on a map that guides me through my research. The European culture practices allow them to interject their viewpoints from colonization. The colonization, therefore, has a relationship with culture, and as I have found, culture and legal systems have a relationship, so they share a relationship with each other. The bubbles that stem off of the legal systems are some of the things I focused on when I was studying the legal systems of each culture and country. And the religion has its own bubble because I think that it's such a big component of each culture that it deserves to have its own relationship with culture. For my pilot project, I really wanted to study on just the imperialism of each country. I first examined the country before imperial powers and examined how the societies were acting and how the culture and the legal systems were. And then after the imperial powers, I also researched how they changed and how each imperial powers interjected their viewpoints and changed the culture and the legal systems collectively. I also examined how the countries that did not have any colonial powers, how they had more of a linear connection between culture and legal systems because there were no outside influences from other cultures and countries. For my pathways, I decided to choose English and history. For my English components, I am doing a research paper for my final project. This includes consulting my English teacher mentors here at Bangor High School. And for my history components, I am researching the historical component of the history of each country and the imperialism, and that's really important for understanding my project. My interests for creating this project was I want to go into a political science field, and although this is a different type of legal system, I think it's important to learn about other cultures and countries around the world and how they conduct their societies. And I also just love learning about other cultures, and I found it really interesting, and I learned a lot through conducting my research. For values outside the classroom, there's a great significance in learning about other cultures, especially for the Humanities Academy, but also becoming a good global citizen. And I think it's really important to learn about other places, and also just introducing new ideas about how legal systems were created and why. That's a different idea for the Humanities Academy, and I think it just adds another perspective. And what will I do for my project and what will I need? For next year, I plan on gathering more sources and more information that will just support my claims further. And as I've mentioned, I will be creating a research project for my final. And for next year, I will also need to be consulting with my mentors often for edits and constructive criticism and guidance, making sure my research paper is the best it can be, and possibly consulting experts in the field of political science and getting their views on how culture and legal systems share connection. That's it. Thank you.
All right, I think. No, this way, that way. Okay. Look at this, I'm figuring it out. All right,
Put up the one that I posted? Or is this the one?
this is the one that's in there. Is that not?
So
the-
I deleted one and then I put a new one in.
This is the one that is currently in there right now.
Yes. So this
Okay.
should be the right
All
one.
right, great. Oh my goodness. I need to introduce you. Okay,
Oh,
so
sorry.
it's okay. Next up we have Genevieve Sichters. There we go. And you should just be able to put the arrow keys to move.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Genevieve Sichters and I'm a junior in the Humanities program. And for my pre-capstone project, I chose to study religion, specifically how religion has evolved and impacted societies. So what am I studying really? Religion is a broad topic and I could go about my research in many different ways. However, my project aims to see how religion has evolved because I want to find out if we owe our complex society to the idea of faith, in order to help my reader understand the universality of faith and how different religious denominations can peacefully coexist. To complete my pre-capstone project, I needed to choose 2 pathways to incorporate into my project, so I chose English and history. I did this by focusing on history of religion itself and then choosing to write a research essay to present what I find. Before I began my research, I came up with 5 research questions whose purpose would be to structure my research for this semester and for next year. They are as follows. How did religion evolve conceptually? How did religion affect the building of communities? How similar are the world's religions? What was religion's role in early conflicts? And how tolerant are religions of one another? So why did I choose this project? I've grown up in a family that views religion from an intellectual perspective rather than a spiritual one. And this intellectual view, combined with my interest in ancient civilizations, has led to my view of religion as a cultural catalyst. Additionally, 62% of the world is religious, which means religion plays a significantly important role in the lives of more than half the world's population. And although we might not understand everyone, we need to make an effort to understand that which we don't. Once I had an idea of what I needed to be searching for, I began months of research focusing on whether my project would even work. I met with my mentors and consulted online resources and texts to come up with a conceptual framework for my pre-capstone project. It centers around 5 main ideas, and they are as follows. Humans are predisposed to create religion. Global religions mirror one another. Religion justifies culture. Religion is crafted by geography. And religion advances culture. After all the research I had done, I had to do something with it to prove that I'd actually learned something that would add substance to my final project next year. And so I decided to create a timeline that represents the evolution of religion by marking key moments in history. And so I know it's a little difficult to see, but the 3 moments that I chose were Neanderthal burials, cave drawings, and Venus figures, because when it came to Neanderthal burials, it demonstrated this idea of death in communities. And for cave drawings, the cave wasn't seen as a place of rest, but more of a place where you went to connect with the outside world in a more spiritual way. And then Venus figures represented this idea of fertility and birth. So religion began as this understanding of this importance between life and death within religions and the connection with the outside world. I also decided to test out a survey idea that I had for next year. I did this by creating a questionnaire tailored towards people who are part of the Jewish community. The purpose of these questions is to discover the tolerance among different religions and to understand the divide between religion and culture. So what I have up there is just my introduction to my survey that I created. And so some of the sample questions are, do you believe that you are do you believe that you have to have Jewish blood to be Jewish? And also, when you think about other monotheistic religions such as Christianity or Islam, what comes to mind? Some open-ended questions and some multiple choice in order to give the people answering the question a little bit more of a chance to explain themselves. While I may have got a good start on my project, I still have much to complete before I can finish. Next year, I must continue with my online research, watching videos, reading articles, and searching for data. But I also need to complete my surveys for the rest of my chosen faith traditions and send them out so I can receive and interpret the data that they present. Lastly, I need to utilize community connections to conduct interviews with other historians, leaders of faith traditions. I might have completed my pre-capstone pilot study, but I still have another year of research ahead of me. To form the community connections that I mentioned in my previous slide, there are many people I must reach out to.
leaders of religious traditions, teachers at Bangor High School, other historians of the community itself. It is necessary for the following year that I utilize not only the connections that I have, but to form new ones if I am to complete this project. Next year, when I finish all my interviews, research, and surveys, I plan to create a research essay that follows the history of religion while also explaining the information's application in the modern day. I also plan to build off my pilot study timeline with the history of various civilizations and include a map that depicts the diffusion of religion over the globe to accompany my essay and make it easier for my reader to follow my written work. My overall goal for my capstone project is to educate people on the similarities between those who practice and those who don't practice a faith tradition. I want people to understand why it is important not to force their practices on someone else, but to respect their traditions and view them as equals. Religion and culture aren't as different as we think, and I hope to prove that through my research. Thank you all so much for your attention. No, this way.
Next up, we have Caroline Slaughter.
Oh, good baby.
Hello everyone, my name is Caroline Sada and I will be presenting to you about researching food systems for my Humanities Capstone project. So I have set out to study the history of food systems in the Americas, and this includes researching the agricultural practices of the United States and Indigenous Americans. My ultimate goal is to show audiences what a food system is, where our modern food systems come from, and what it means to have a sustainable system for the future. So why did I pick this topic? I have always been fascinated with how food impacts people's lives. I love to go to farmers markets and bake and cook, and I like studying historic recipes. There's really something universal about food that impacts everyone, and it can be a very cultural element. I also took an early college class about an introduction to food systems, and I realized how important it is to study food through a systematic lens. And I want more people to learn about food systems so that more people will be familiar with that. Over the course of my junior year, I have developed research questions to help guide the majority of my research. They are as follows. How has the United States and indigenous food systems developed over time? How has access to food changed in the Americas? And what are the sustainable and unsustainable aspects of both the American and indigenous food systems? So this is my conceptual framework, and it's basically a visual representation of my research. What I've found so far is that a food system impacts culture, environment, economy, and access, and there can be both unsustainable and sustainable aspects of these systems. By studying the history of a system, we can understand the foundation of our modern systems, and it is with that that we can decide our systems for the future. So I know I've been throwing a lot of terms like food system and sustainability at you, and I know a lot of people aren't very familiar with those terms. So for my pilot study, I've created an ArcGIS story map, which I'll explain in a moment, that really helps audiences understand what those terms mean and to give people a more in-depth look in what will prepare them for understanding the rest of my research. So ArcGIS Story Maps is a program software that I'm using, and it's basically like a guided website that I've created where viewers can scroll through text and multimedia like images, hyperlinks, and videos, and they get to explore whatever concept that I'm showing. For my bigger capstone project, I'm going to make more story maps that explore the history and all the other research that I accumulate. So the two pathways that I'm using are history, because that offers perspective and it will help us understand how our current systems came about and how we can take our systems for the future. And also the English pathway, because I will be using storytelling, and storytelling is a vital form of communication, and I will really use my writing skills on my story maps to reach a wider audience. So I anticipate for the next year that I will need a lot of advice and feedback on the story maps as I create them. I will engage in more historical research, and I have two mentors who are currently helping me focus my research and develop original arguments. I'm also anticipating visiting museums and archives, which might have vital historical resources that could really enhance my project. So what is this all for? What is the purpose of this project? To some extent, we are all participants of a food system, whether we're aware of it or not, and we all contribute to sustainability and unsustainability in some ways. And so ultimately, I just want to raise awareness of this and show people what food systems are and also what systems thinking is. A lot of things can be viewed in a systematic lens, and I think more people should come to appreciate that we can and should view the world in different ways. Thank you.
So let's have one more round of applause. Those are our junior pre-capstone students. And now we're going to segue into our senior capstone students who have had 2 years of research to pull together into their culminating projects. Well, let's give our pre-capstone students one more round of applause. Thank you. Oh. Apologies, friends, just one moment while I locate the right presentation. All right, and first up for our capstone students, I would like to introduce Annalena Whitman.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annalena, and I'm a senior, and I've been in this program for 4 years now. And my project is Humans of Bangor. So Humans of Bangor, what is it? So pretty much my entire life, I've passed strangers on the street and sort of wondered what their lives are like and where they're coming from and where they're going and pretty much just like everything in between. So Humans of Bangor is inspired by the similarly titled Humans of New York, and it's a collection of stories featuring the strangers of Bangor, Maine. So what I did is I approached strangers on the street and asked them to share their stories, and then they would let me take a photograph of them, and then I would post it all online on my blog. And so what I hope to do was by putting these stories together, I hope to illuminate the human condition that exists both here in Bangor and also everywhere around the world. So these were my research questions, and I had one sort of overarching research question, which was how do individual stories illuminate the larger human experience? And in order to better answer that, my 3 other questions were, how diverse will the stories of a small town be? Will interviewing strangers change my perspective that I have on Bangor? And how does interviewing strangers affect the interviewer's empathy? And so in order to answer these questions, I made a conceptual framework. And as you can tell, my conceptual framework centers completely around empathy. And so because storytelling is a prime way of building empathy, my project aims to increase the reader's empathy after they've read and, experienced the stories that I've collected and put together in my blog. And this is really important because having empathy helps us, obviously treat the people around us the way that we'd like to be treated. And, in our little way helps us make our little corners of the world better. And so hopefully when people read the stories that are in Humans of Bangor, they will learn to, appreciate and empathize with others' experiences better. So the connection to my pathways were English and social studies. The connection to my English pathway was that, my whole project was about storytelling, and that is pretty much a lot of what English is. And storytelling is, the writing and the telling of struggles. And, that's English, and it's also my project. So, it's all connected. And then the connection to the social studies pathway is because social studies are the study of the diverse and dynamic nature of society, and that is also what my stories document. So this is why storytelling and empathy are important. And as you can see, empathy is just really important in all aspects of life. It helps us get along with people, work more effectively, adjust to new circumstances, build connections. There are a lot of benefits on when parents teach their children empathy, and in turn are role models in empathy, on how, and because that helps their children become more empathetic in the long run. And then also storytelling sort of does the same thing in the fact that it creates connections between people and ideas, as well as, between people themselves. And, it all centers around empathy, back to that conceptual framework as well. So my methodology, how I actually did this project. So that is a picture of me circa sometime last May, maybe. I had different hair then. So pretty much before the weather turned cold, I went to popular places in Bangor, which a lot of the time ended up being downtown or by the Canuskeag Stream, and I would go up to people and I would ask them if they were interested in being part of a project that I was doing for school, and I got a lot of no's, but I also got a lot of yeses. And so I would talk to them and I would record our conversations with this app called Just Press Record, and so then afterwards which was a great app by the way, and afterwards I would, write everything that was recorded, I would write it down so it became less of a conversation and more of a story. And then I would post it all online at my blog, which was at www.humansofbangor.blogspot.com. And along the way, if I ever had problems, I would talk to my advisors, who were Ms. Hendricks and also Ms. Throckmorton, who is an English teacher here at Bangor. So these were my common interview questions. So what you'll notice from these questions is that they're not introductory questions or getting to know you questions. They're more questions that get right to the point. And this helps to build more of a relationship with your interviewer, with the person that you're interviewing, so that, because if you ask the right questions, it's easier for them to tell you the stories that, really get to the heart of who people are, and not just sort of filler questions and filler answers. It just helps you helps them to get them to tell you stuff that was a little bit more personal. So you guys can read them on screen, but yeah. Yes. And this is the use of empathy in my interviews in order to make them as connect with my people as much as possible. So for effective eye contact, for instance, it makes people feel seen and heard, and that just improves communication in general. So mirroring face muscles and face muscle patterns and expressions, doing that gives away others' feelings towards something, and it helps us understand their feelings and respond back in a good way. And posture, it indicates the person's mood. So like sitting slumped indicates a lack of interest and sadness, but sitting more upright indicates more respect and confidence. And then facing forward, it's like having your legs and your arms uncrossed and leaning towards someone. It really encourages open communication and trust. So this is the link to my blog. I'm not quite sure how to get there. Oh, perfect. Can you click on it and then click? Okay, perfect. So this is my blog. So for instance, these are all the people that I took pictures of. As you can tell, for some of them, they didn't want me to take their picture, which was really deceptive because, for instance, you might think that this guy might not have a lot to say, but then if you scroll, he had a lot to say. This guy was really interesting. For instance, he was a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he was an avid reader, and it was really interesting to see the connections in his life between the Vietnam War and how he grew up and how reading really impacted his life. And for me, that was like amazing because I also love to read, and so that was a really cool one. 1 second. But then a lot of these people were from downtown, so pretty much I would just have their picture, I'd have the date that I took the interview, and then down below I would have their story. And some of them are short and some of them are a lot longer, but pretty much I was able to collect about 15 interviews, just from, and as you can tell, they're from all parts of the year when I was able to do it, and yeah. Okay, let me get back. Miss Hendricks, do you know how to put it back on present mode? I'm not entirely sure. No. Oh, there we go. And then... Cool, thank you so much. And so these were the results to my research questions. For my first question, for how diverse the stories of a small town would be, the answer was pretty much very incredibly diverse. I assume that many people, since they had come from the same type of background, like origin or social class, I thought that their stories and who they were in general would just be very similar, and this proved to be very, very incorrect. People were from pretty much all over, although it was true that they were, a lot of people were from New England, which makes sense, but even so, I thought that nearly everyone was going to be from the local area, and that was not true. And even if they had their similar beginnings, they became very different people. For my second question about how will it change my perspective on Bangor, the answer was also a lot. I sort of realized halfway through the project that I had a lot of biases about Bangor. I've grown up here and lived here pretty much my whole life, and so I feel like a lot of people in my peer group have this idea that like small town people are like boring and uninteresting. But like I said, the interviews and the stories that I found really prove that wrong. And like I said, although there was a lack of diversity in terms of national origin, that should definitely be noted. Very much a main thing. It is still true that all of my respondents, they had very different lives, and they were definitely not as cookie cutter as I thought that they would be. And for my third research question, how it will affect my empathy, my level of empathy, I realize it's sort of difficult to quantify a level of empathy, but what I noticed was that going into the project, I definitely had preconceived notions of who I was and how empathetic I was. But then I realized during the interview process that I was still really judging people based on their appearances and the kind of stories that I thought that they were going to be telling me. But then once I realized this, I was able to confront it better and allow myself to just simply put, just go with the flow, see what they tell you. And I noticed that by the end of the process, I was thinking less about what I thought they were going to tell me and just being more into the, what are you telling me right now? And trying to be the best interviewer that I could be in that sense. And so for my reflections, that's just a screenshot of when the project wasn't completely done yet. Oh, wait, I'm so sorry. Apologies. And so all of these questions helped me answer my overarching question, which was how individual stories illuminate the larger human experience. And pretty much what I realized was that when stories are analyzed as a unit, instead of separately, it's easier to see the bigger picture and find similarities between people, and they help us identify the human condition by allowing us to see how similar we are. So then for my reflection, I had two big takeaways from my project. The first was kind of personal, which was that I was a lot less brave than I thought I was going into this. I was like, yeah, I'm fine. I can talk to people. Like, I know what I'm doing. Like, I'm gonna be okay. But sort of about halfway through the project, I encountered some serious setbacks with just getting like really anxious and just being like, oh my God, like I can't even go up to somebody, like it's too scary. And that was very interesting for me because I had not seen that coming. I had seen myself as like a person who could just go out there and do it. But when that happened, I would write down what I was having struggles with, and then I would go and talk to my advisors about it to see what I could do better next time to make sure that my interviews were going the best that they could. And and what I also learned was that when I would start a conversation, it would be the hardest part. And then as soon as I would get into a conversation, the entire thing would become so much easier. And finally, my second takeaway is that, simply put, struggles are, they're what make us human. I feel like many times the struggles are what people in life sort of sweep under the rug, but every single time that you asked somebody what was happening in their life, it was always about the struggles. It was very, very rarely about the good parts. Not that there weren't good parts, but that what they were having difficulties with were what had shaped them into who they had become. And I think that's something that in identifying the human condition is very incredibly important. And I think that's very important to highlight. And those are my sources. Thank you so much for your time.
All right.
Next up, we have Gabriel Schmidt. Do you want me to arrow for you?
Yeah, I can't really use them.
Okay.
I'll just.
Okay.
Okay, so for my presentation, I did a project. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about Rojava, or some people pronounce it Rojava, and it is a case study of the success of direct democracy. So for my capstone project, I actually did a project about anarchy and the many societies and ideologies which it has taken. But for this presentation, I'll be focusing on one of the societies which I looked at, which is Rojava. So for my questions, I had what is anarchy? Why are there so few examples of anarchist societies? And in the few examples we have, is there evidence that anarchy is a viable political system? And right there is my conceptual framework, where I talked about anarchist theorists, and the societies which are anarchist. So going on to Rojava. So what is Rojava? So Rojava is also called the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. So northeastern Syria is a region that is predominantly which is populated predominantly by Kurdish people, and during the Syrian civil war, this nation was established because what happened was when the Syrian civil war broke out, it was between the government led by Assad and a bunch of rebel groups that opposed Assad. And so these members of the rebel group, the Free Syrian Army, they predominantly were fighting Assad in like the southern regions of Syria. And so previously, Syria had a lot of troops stationed in the northeastern region because that's where a lot of Kurds lived. And there's always been fears in Syria of a Kurdish nationalist uprising. But because of the civil war, they had to withdraw a lot of troops from that region to the south. And because of that, a political organization called the DUP, which is the Democratic Union Party, was able to create this collective nation of individual communes that are made up of villages in Rojava. So basically, after that, the Syrian government basically just like completely forgot about that region, and the DUP was able to create this nation called Rojava. And part of the reason why it was able to sustain itself was because the US actually supported them and gave them funding. And the reason why is because they were one of the only effective fighting forces against ISIS. So the US went on and gave them weapons. So the communes of Rojava. So on the left, you may see there's an Antifa flag. So Rojava gets a lot of international battalions, similar to like you may have seen in Ukraine, for instance. A lot of foreign volunteers go to Ukraine, and the same is true for Rojava. In Rojava, a lot of international battalions go there to fight for Rojava. So in Rojava, there is a very decentralized government. Instead, it is a collective of villages in the area of northeastern Syria, and they're called communes. And so it's a direct democracy in the sense that all members of a village or a commune will go to a meeting house and then make decisions based on democratic vote and direct democracy. And in their constitution, they specifically do it by secret ballot, which I thought was interesting. So on top of that, there's also something called the joint presidency, which many might point out and say, oh, so it's not anarchist then because there's a person with power. But in reality, the joint president doesn't have that much power, but rather they act more as an overseer as compared to someone that actually has authority in Rojava. And so how the communes are structured, the communes are made out of 12 committees. And for instance, there are certain committees that they have to have that are outlined in the Constitution. So one of them is the Language Committee. And the Language Committee is responsible for preserving languages of the many ethnic groups that live in Rojava. I said before that there are a lot of Kurds that live in Rojava. But in addition to that, there are also a lot of other ethnic groups. And the goal of the Language Committee is to preserve those different cultures, native languages. And another committee in the communes is a parties committee that organizes and keeps track of political groups in the different communes. And then in addition to that, there are also like a few other committees which some communes have, but others don't. For instance, one commune has an arts and pottery committee that does arts and pottery, as it may be obvious. And not every commune has that. Think of it like a high school elective. Some communes can pick committees to have and some don't. It's more of a choice, but for some committees, they have to have them. So Rojava's economic system. So Rojava's economic system is primarily based on a libertarian socialist model. So in Rojava, their different workplaces are created via worker collectivization. So instead of a boss being at the top of a workplace and workers at the bottom, instead it is made up just a group of workers that have an equal number of power in the society. So on the left, as you may see here, this is a sewing cooperative. So all the workers that you see pictured here, they all own the means of production collectively. Right now, as you can see, they're making uniforms for the army of Rojava, and I'll talk about them later. So another thing about Rojava is that they're primarily agrarian. So they also have a lot of small farms in Rojava. And originally, when the revolution started, they had this plan where they were going to have voluntary collectivization of private property of the farmland because they didn't want any conflict with local landlords. Like during the Russian Revolution, farms were seized, whereas in Rojava, they didn't want to do that, and instead they just allowed landowners to give them the land. And this actually worked quite well for them, as many landowners would just give it up and collectivize the land. And then another committee in the communes is the Social Economic Committee, and they handle economic affairs that aren't primarily related to agriculture. So they mainly help with consumer goods and like infrastructure projects. And when economic projects are done, they're always done via worker co-ops because that is their philosophy about economics. So gender equality is a huge thing that Rojava strives for. One of the primary goals of Rojava was actually to create a nation that was built on gender equality. So in the Rojavan Constitution, they have a lot of different parts which specifically outline the Rojava being a place where men and women are seen as equal. So one line is equality between men and women in all fields of life. That is one of the core tenets of Rojava as outlined in the Constitution. So in Rojava, jobs are also chosen with gender equality in mind. So for instance, every profession has to have a 50-50 gender ratio. So half of the workers are women and half are men. So for instance, the healthcare system in Rojava, which of course is free, half of the doctors are women and the other half are men. And then another thing about gender equality is actually their army. So the army of Rojava is called the People's Defense Units, and the People's Defense Units also have something called the Women's Protection Units within them. And the Women's Protection Units are specifically a women's militia to defend Rojava. And they have a separate army for women because they wanted to make sure that women had their own army so that the army would never become too patriarchal. So, yeah. So eco-socialism, we just keep getting more left-wing. So in addition to all the other cool stuff they do, they're also really into the environment. And as you on the left, those are women of the Women's Defense Units, and they're in a collectivized greenhouse. So Rojava has a special relationship with the environment. They specifically do sustainable farming practices to make sure that the land isn't over-farmed. They also create greenhouses in order to grow crops so that the farmland isn't completely destroyed. They also reject the idea of using fossil fuels. Rojava sits on a huge amount of oil fields, but they reject the usage of them. Instead, they primarily rely on hydroelectric power. So, but there's been this major problem recently because the rivers that they use for hydroelectric power are primarily, part of them are in Turkey. And because Rojava is such a largely Kurdish nation, Turkey has been purposely trying to cut off the rivers from Rojava in order to stop the electricity that goes there. And this is because Turkey has historically oppressed the Kurdish people because they always have had this fear that there's going to be a Kurdish nationalist uprising because around 20% of Turkey belongs to the Kurdish ethnic group. So they also have a large focus on protections for minorities and ethnic groups. So Rojava strives for gender equality, but also equality among minority groups. So a big reason why is because the Kurds have always have sympathized with a lot of other ethnic groups because they are one of the many groups in the Middle East that have been oppressed by larger nations. So for instance, Rojava has a large population of Assyrians and Arabs. And the Constitution of Rojava specifically says that no one is subject to degradation or discrimination based on identity, religion, or ethnicity. So Rojava also has a bunch of protections for religious groups. They officially are a secular nation, but they still have they still allow people to practice whatever religion they please. And this is my last slide. So this is just like a compilation of miscellaneous pictures. So on the top left, that's a part of the extracurricular activities that Rojava does. They fund a lot of youth programs. So right there, they are playing traditional music that is played in the region. In the top right is a celebration during Christmas time. So Christmas, they have a small population of Christians in Rojava. Even though the majority are not Christians, they still celebrate religious holidays. And at the bottom is an example of the irrigation system they have in regards to agriculture, because as I said before, Rojava is a primarily agrarian society. And so that's it.
Thank you. Okay.
So next up, we have Cant and Stockford, and their project is a video project. But would you like to stand up and wave at the audience so they know who you are?
Thank you.
All right. I hope the sound is going to work. Let's see. Let's. Do you know how to fix this? Because it seems like the volume is up. Well, I just unplugged it because even if I have to hold the microphone up, I'm not going to listen to it.
Presentation volume.
Hi everyone, my name is Caden Stockford, and today I'll be talking to you about my Humanities Capstone project, in-person versus online learning, and explaining the steps I took to complete the project. This topic stood out to me because the structure of education has changed in drastic ways over just the last few years, and I wanted to learn more about what this change means for us in terms of getting a beneficial education. To begin the presentation, I wanted to share my elevator speech, which is basically my project proposal from Humanities PreCapstone in junior year. I'm studying the differences between remote and in-person learning because I want to share the disadvantages and advantages of each option for those that are struggling to understand in order to contribute facts to the controversy and help students and parents understand what's best for them and their child. The research questions I created to guide my research are virtual versus in-person learning, which is more prone to success. Could the future of education be remote learning, and do virtual classes limit our education? The information I was hoping to collect with these questions was centered around whether or not virtual learning could be beneficial in ways that in-person learning is not. My final two research questions are, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each method? And do the pros outweigh the cons, vice versa, or do they even one another out? My hope was that these questions would tell me not only if virtual learning could be beneficial, but also the ways in which in-person learning could be beneficial. I wanted to analyze each method from all angles and try to limit any bias. From this presentation, I hope to learn more about the science behind each style of education. In order to determine a final educated opinion, I knew I would need to work with more than just personal experiences and opinions, so naturally, I turned to the science behind it all. I knew my experiences and opinions of in-person and remote learning, but I wanted a concrete answer to my question, which I soon found out was impossible. Throughout the different phases of remote learning over the pandemic, I had a wide range of experiences from full remote learning to hybrid learning and then back to remote learning after having a surgery. What I noticed was that my grades and how well I did in school really depended on factors that weren't entirely in my control. My goal was to figure out if others had similar experiences or if it was unique from person to person. So let's take a look at the concept map that I put together during my junior year. I wanted to show the aspects of each method, what they have in common, why each is somewhat controversial, and the definition of what the best education looks like. I concluded that the best education is simply the education that best provides the individual student with the environment and learning style that will benefit them the most. I went about getting my information through a combination of research, first-hand experiences, and feedback from teachers and other students. While I knew I needed research to back up my claims, I also wanted to compare what those around me experienced with what the data showed. I think doing more polls would have been beneficial to my research, but overall the information I gathered was sufficient to draw a conclusion from. So these are a few of the quotes that I pulled from my research. I would go more in depth about their meanings, but since that's the focus of my photo essay, I thought I would save that for later. Out of the research that I gathered, I tried to find 8 sources that supported online learning and 8 that supported in-person learning, so I would have plenty of information to sort through and choose from. My methods for analyzing my research were primarily focused on looking at both points of view for each learning style, sorting my information so I knew what I had in front of me, and asking myself, how is it relevant for each piece of information I came across? This helped me eliminate the information that strayed too far from my topic and figure out what pieces of information were more important than others. So I wanted to share a little bit about my experiences in regards to learning during the pandemic. At the beginning, when all learning was remote, it took a while to adjust and get the hang of the online format. My grades definitely struggled for a little bit, but I quickly learned how to manage my time better. Starting my junior year, we had the option to try hybrid learning. I found this to be really beneficial, but unfortunately, it didn't last my whole year. Towards the end of junior year, I went back to remote learning for medical reasons and found that learning was even harder than it had been at the beginning of the pandemic. I found that the main reason behind this was not because of my reasoning for being remote, but simply because of how different classes were structured and how effectively or ineffectively my teachers and I were able to communicate. On to the results. Using all aspects of my research and my project, I was able to conclude that both points of view about education had valid scientific evidence to prove their claims. I realized there wasn't a concrete answer about education, and it really depends on the individual student. And I got a better understanding as to why some students seem to thrive better with one method than the other. I also succeeded in gathering sufficient research for my visual aspect of my Capstone project, which I will share with you later, as well as establishing connections with teachers and students that I probably wouldn't have connected with otherwise. This project was definitely a learning experience for me and brought me closer to those around me during a time where social interaction was definitely very limited. When analyzing my research, I found that the evidence supporting each method was more than just opinions and had credible sources backing them up, that there are numerous upsides and downsides to both learning styles, and that the style that works best depends on the individual student rather than the idea that one style works best for all. As promised, I included a glimpse of the visual portion of my presentation. I'm very lucky to have teachers that agreed to help me achieve a project that took somewhat of an unintended comical turn. I wanted to include teachers that I've had throughout different stages of pandemic learning and put together a more appealing way to present some of my research findings. In all honesty, I learned a lot more from this project than I had originally expected. Instead of finding the indisputable answer to my referral topic, I ended up with evidence in support of both methods and came to the conclusion that there isn't one style that is scientifically proven to be better than the other. Every student is unique, meaning that the way they learn best is too. Since my project is mainly education-centered, there aren't many connections outside of the classroom, but there are connections outside of my specific classroom. Hopefully this information will help future students decide whether all in-person learning, all online learning, or a little bit of both is the style that they'll thrive best under. If anything is taken from this presentation, let it be that what works for one person might not be what works for another. To conclude this portion of the presentation, I hope that my project and research helped to answer any questions about in-person versus remote learning and help to show that this topic is way more than what meets the eye. Learning styles differ from student to student, and that is something that shouldn't be dismissed or looked upon lightly, but rather something that should be embraced and acknowledged. Lastly, this project has shown me how ineffective the school system is in allowing a large percentage of students to thrive academically. To all the students that are struggling and felt the way that I did, I want you to know that you are not alone, and a change in learning methods might be your key to improving academically.
Next up, we have Isabel Kidwell.
Are you able to show Caden's photo as
Oh, I can just look in it because you shared with me. This is a lot. Yeah. And yay.
Hi. Hi. Thank you all for coming. My name is Isabel Kidwell and I'm a senior. My capstone project is on progressive Western literature, and it's about the systematic whitewashing of history through fiction and how contemporary writers can strive for accurate demographic inclusion. So a little bit of background information. The 1800s in the Western world, literature was dominated by the Romantic and Realist genres, and if those don't really ring a bell, these genres inherently reflect times of great social political change. So some examples of texts you may have heard of or read in school are The Scarlet Letter, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The following is my elevator speech. I chose the 1800s time period to guide me in my understanding of how writers, even if they hope to be progressive, can both benefit and further harm the social-political environment based on inaccurate demographic inclusion. And that includes my own historical research, literary analysis, and creative writing. So my justification is composed of a claim and 5 whys. My claim is I want to learn about how 1800s progressive writers contributed to whitewashing through their fiction. Number 1, why? Because I'm curious about the snowball effect of demographic misrepresentation and how that could have affected popular media today. Next 2, because I want to learn about the true historical demographic populations of Western cities at the time. 3, because I want to accurately represent diverse populations in my own writing. The last 2, because I want to be a novelist myself and I'd also like to be conscious of representation in my works. And finally, because fair media representation is very important to me as a Latina, and I feel that creative writing is principally about celebrating all people in the world we live in. So these are my essential questions. How did social political ideas shape the themes, motifs, and/or tropes found in 19th century popular Western literature? How should contemporary authors interpret such literature and improve their writing's representation? And how can the lessons I learned about this stuff help me to write a representative novel written in the 1800s, or based in the 1800s? Sub-questions. What was the social political climate regarding justice issues in the Western 19th century? How were Western city populations misrepresented in the era's literature, to what end and for what agenda? And how can contemporary writers attempting a more representative and historically accurate text help to create a counter-narrative? The purpose of this project was to learn about the true and accurate social-political environment of the 1800s Western world so that I could write a story reflective of the time's true diversity. And that's because I believe that accurate representation is important to both the inclusion of readers as well as the trustworthiness of the text, especially if it's historical fiction. This is my conceptual framework. As you can see, I found that the historical time and situation affects the social and political ideas of the time, which therefore bleeds into the prevalent themes of that time's literature, but also simultaneously that this thematic exploration in literature affects discussion of ideas in society and therefore further develops social and political ideas as a whole. This is some of my literature review. I read nonfiction texts on literary criticism as well as nonfiction texts on literary analysis, and there's more. I also read nonfiction texts on the 19th century history, which were principally how I researched the historical background, and I also read fiction texts from the 19th century, which I focused my analysis on. There were 5 fiction texts, and they are by Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Louisa May Alcott, Jane Austen, and Mark Twain. These are some of the analysis strategies I used when analyzing those 5 fiction texts that I just mentioned. There's a Marxist social class lens, which, as you might think, focuses on social class and wealth. Historical lens, such as the historical background and facts of the past. Gender and feminist lens, how characters are treated based on their gender. And critical race lens, how characters are treated based on their race. This was my methodology. So for PreCapstone last year, I chose this focus of the 1800s and Western literature, and I furthered on with studying the social political environment or the history of the West in the 1800s, and then I read and analyzed those 5 texts that I talked about. And for Capstone, I decided for my analysis that there was a gap in accurate representation in the time period literature, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit. From the books or movies based on books that you may have seen or read, you may be under the impression that in the West, cities at the time of the 1800s were not very diverse, but you would be wrong. And when I realized this gap, I decided to write my own novel set in the 1800s to kind of address that, and I think the next slide goes into that. Yes, it does. So I changed course because in PreCapstone, before I realized this, I was just going to do a literary analysis blog where I would file all of my analysis work on this fiction text and talk about what I learned about reading from the 1800s. But when I realized that there was this gap in misrepresentation, I decided that the analysis blog would only be acknowledging the issue and not actually addressing it, which is why I decided to write my own book. So this is my book thus far. Sorry you don't get an excerpt because I'm trying to publish it in copyright. So here's a little picture. It's almost done and I'm very excited. Like I said, I plan to publish it. And yeah, it's in the 1800s. That's what you get. Okay. Okay, these are my main results for my project. In the Western world, the 19th century was a time of extreme social inequity and misunderstanding, and while these progressive writers seemed to strive towards inclusion, they commonly included only white, male, and or wealthy perspectives in their stories, which is effectively whitewashing. And this has problems, but it is still progress, because the unfortunate reality of this time is that if these writers did not focus on the white perspective, their books would not sell. Analysis, I got 2 main lessons. I'm not suggesting that inclusive fiction is about checking boxes. That is performative activism, and it's something I don't believe in because it undermines historical struggles. I'll elaborate on that a little bit as well. I'll tell you a little bit more about my story. It takes place in Chicago in 1874, and in this time, I don't know how much familiar you are, but you may think that it was mostly white people, and it was not. There are a lot of African Americans coming up from the South, and there are also a lot of Asian Americans coming through the railroads from the Pacific, and also a lot of Latinos coming up from Mexico. But one thing that if you were trying to be inclusive and include everybody, you could be lying in a completely other side of the spectrum, because, for example, including a Native American in this story would be harmful and would be a lie, because at this time all Native Americans, because Chicago was Native American land, were forced out. And including someone in a story just for the sense of inclusion would actually be lying and pretending that their genocide did not exist. So what I believe in and encourage other writers to consider is the historically accurate inclusion of all people who are present in real life settings. And for the second lesson, I do understand that writers will, of course, never get it all right, and I definitely won't either. But as long as they conduct objective demographic research and create accordingly, I believe that they'll learn as they go as humans, and that's all we can hope for. So for my conclusion, history is brutal, and so is the present. But shying away from events of the past or today undermines the struggles that various groups of people have had and dealt with. So including everyone in an effort to be inclusive when not all groups of people at the time were treated equally is a lie, and it is harmful. Diversity then is more than acknowledging the presence and existence of groups of people. It's also taking the time to learn about them and treat their history accordingly and respectfully. And that's my sources. Thank you.
Hold on. Why does it say present and record? Okay. Hold on.
I think you could download it and then
Yeah. Hold on. We're gonna go back to the mountains for a minute.
Yeah, I sent you because I wasn't sure what you would prefer.
We'll get it. Take two.
All right.
And next up is Morgan Basinski.
Before I go, I'd like to acknowledge I was supposed to be the penultimate speaker tonight, but our classmate Madison Miller could not be here because she's testifying in Washington, D.C. right now on legislation on gun violence. And I want to just acknowledge her wonderful work before I moved on and do this. So my capstone was about approaching mental health in high schools, particularly with the privilege of looking at Bangor High School. And so with my elevator pitch, I wanted to find out what mental health resources are the most effective for adolescents and how to best proactively support students in navigating mental hardship, particularly exacerbated by COVID-19. So I came up with a lot of research questions because there's just so much to ask yourself about what we know about mental health within adolescence, particularly in these ever-changing times. And so my first question was, how can schools best support students in maintaining a mentally healthy environment conducive to success? And then I realized that was a lot to put into one question. So I broke it down into 5 different sub-questions. How can students better articulate their needs in a way better met by educators and administrators? How can mental health and social emotional learning curriculum be extended beyond elementary schools? What can we do to create emotionally tenacious students? What does being proactive look like in regards to student mental health? And what do administrators and educators not know / don't feel confident tackling in regards to student mental health? And so these are very big questions that I did a lot of research beforehand. And so I have a conceptual framework where before I started in my actual project, which was research regarding focus groups within the high school, I wanted to cover the bases as to seeing what supports were already being given and what was done in schools, particularly in Maine currently, because I do not want to give the impression that any issues presented here are unique to Bangor High School or even to Maine, but it's important to acknowledge all the different intricacies that go along within legislation like we see with LD 609, as well as personal county-wide legislation and school systems. And so my conceptual framework was ultimately kind of leading towards a justification towards working with such topic matter and why we needed to do this research. And so my two pathways, you'll never guess what they are, English and history, but I chose to word it more with the social sciences because I feel like that's where my priorities lie with. So when looking with English, I looked a lot at communication systems within classrooms and within school departments to see how best to support students. And I did a lot of data analysis with narrative coding and interviews. So a lot of my work was dissection of a story. And so with the social sciences aspects, mental health is inherently linked to psychology, as well as looking at mental health within a school system where there is a power hierarchy. You have to look at these power hierarchies and discuss a bit of sociology. And so with my focus groups, I gathered different advisories and different elective classes and asked them about the resources and experiences they've had at Bangor High School. And so this was the front side of the handout that I gave all of the students who decided to participate. It was an optional thing to participate because I didn't want to force anybody to share anything that they weren't comfortable with. And I made sure to cover my bases and have the students understand that this was not a place to dole out personal diagnoses, as I did not want anybody to feel pressured to share more information than would have been permissible by them. And so how I got my different participants, I reached out to different advisories and I engaged with different elective classes whose focus aligns with my research. So looking at history classes, looking at research-oriented science classes, and I discussed many different issues with students who were very interested in my study, and I reached out to their advisories that way. And so I wanted to make sure everybody knew exactly what they were getting into. So I gave them an informed consent and confidentiality form. And so one of the most important factors of my research was creating a safe space where students felt that they could discuss things candidly. And so having this was a very important aspect to me, and so that they knew everything, how my research was going to impact them. One of the biggest things about my research was maintaining anonymity, because I didn't want any student to feel like they were being particularly eagle eyes watched when I was doing my analysis, and I didn't want them to feel that that the information that they were providing me was not going to be protected. So the questions I asked my participants: how do you or do you not feel supported at Bangor High School? What impact do you think the social emotional learning curriculum, i.e. the advisory lessons and the 10 lessons from last year around Block C, have had regarding your ability to cope with COVID-19 and the standard teenage experience? What resources have you found effective or not effective with problems you have experienced in high school? What do you wish educators and administrators knew about high schoolers, and what's a question you wish I asked that I didn't? And so I got amazing responses. So I had 6 different advisories, 2 different elective classes, and when I was going through my transcripts, hours of audio, I found 41 distinct student participants decided to engage with me and in this dialogue with their peers. And so the reason I chose to do focus groups instead of just a survey for individuals was because I really wanted it to be an ongoing conversation and inspire openness about mental health, as well as what we feel like we need to be looking for in striving to do better, because that's all we can do. And so I conducted my focus groups. I had an audio recording software thanks to one of my mentors, Miss Katie Roberts, who unfortunately is not here right now, but she's going through her doctoral program. And so she helped me with transcription software. And another one of my mentors, Miss Stephanie Hendricks, helped me learn how to narrative code because she's also going through her doctoral program. Big flex, but so my greatest challenge was figuring out how to do this well and figuring out what sections put the different narrative codes within. And so I did a little pre-analysis of my analysis and reflected on what students had been telling me and the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. And so I looked into 6 different codes, which led to existing supports, any mentions of teachers and advisories, mentions of what students have to be desired for these supports, as well as communication issues, anything having to do with school counselors, anything regarding tension between students and educators, with a focus on the glamorization of an unhealthy work ethic, also known as grind culture, and dehumanization of students, community building and self-advocacy, and I decided to pull some powerful quotes from students that I felt really encapsulated the spirit of my capstone. And so I can't give you any audio recordings or any direct data because of my promise to keep people anonymous. But I was able to pull out some very powerful quotes that I felt really showed what I was going for with this project, and the honesty and the critical thinking that students were so wonderful to engage with me in. So there was just a lot of wonderful things to be found within this project, and I'll get into that with my findings a bit more. And so my results in my research paper were 5 pages long. So you're essentially getting the SparkNotes version because we don't have time for 5 pages worth of in-depth analysis. So students were finding that teachers were the most supportive supports within the building because they were easily accessible and they had pre-existing relationships with them, but they did not find school counselors to be particularly supportive when it came to emotional issues, but found them to be useful with academic struggles. And so one major issue presented was lack of knowledge about resources, as students frequently were unaware that we have a PCHC health clinic downstairs, and it's been in the building for a few months now, but most of them did not know, as well as the fact that they did not know that we had multiple social workers or where to find them. And so probably the most interesting part of this discourse community that was created was the discourse around advisory. Advisory, for those of you who don't know, is a program that was piloted this year from the guidance department where students are put into groups of about 11 to 12 with one teacher and they meet up every day for 20 minutes. And so advisory has had some highs, some lows, and students have definitely noticed. But what was really interesting was there was a lot of diverse opinions coming from the discussion of advisory, and then they all kind of melded into this general consensus that advisory was a good chance to relax for 20 minutes and make new friends, but there was not enough time to really engage in a very meaningful social emotional learning curriculum within there. And what the students needed was a time to rest from their academic day. And so the last piece that I'm sharing with you tonight is that students in all groups were in agreement, they were unanimously feeling that educators and administrators didn't completely understand that they needed a balance between work and life, and that they weren't students just 24/7. And what was really interesting is that came through with the 4th question of what do you wish educators and administrators knew about students. Every single group said that. There's always one person who mentioned that off the bat. And that was just astonishing to see how in sync all the students were. And so for my analysis, because my results were just what students were saying, and some of the stuff was great, some of it not so great. But with the analysis, it was concluded that many of the resources being provided were effective, but what we really have is a communications issue. And so that's where kind of the English part of my capstone comes in, where we look at communication networks and how to best form a plan that works for administrators, educators, parents, and students. And so what needed to happen was more communication about where to find resources and how to access them and what purpose that they have. And so another issue that I found with the purpose of resources was students were not particularly keen on guidance counselors, but I found that came mostly from a lack of awareness of the role of a school counselor versus the role of a social worker. And that's not necessarily the student's fault, but I think getting into the semantics of things is very important. And so when we look at expectations for school counselors aligning with social workers, I think we can really start to dissect where our issues are and how they lie in communications. And so, like stated, with the two issues, I would recommend the creation of a communication plan for students and a focus on transparency. And for the continuation of work with social emotional curriculum as well as advisory, another major complaint that frequently was voiced was the lack of updated materials being used and making the lessons unrelatable and outdated. And so the recommendation I make on that grievance would be a web presence being maintained and housing virtual resources that are vetted by school officials to provide those supports while maintaining a quality standard that makes the supports accessible for students. Students are responsive to the resources provided. That much has been shown through my research and my focus groups. There's just a need for the resources to be fully realized and advertised in a manner approachable for the target audience. And so my project was these focus groups. They took a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of sleep. So my recommendation for the high school's next steps with advisory would be part of my work with this study. And so the formation of a communication plan, like stated before, and the initiation of discussions with students and faculty about the state of mental health affairs. And we're looking into a presentation to the school committee of my data and findings, as I've been working with the Bangor Citizens Initiative on Mental Health and looking towards the inventory and the assessments used as well as better practices. So, oh, that's it. Oh, that's it.
Thank you so much. And Morgan, I am super glad that you mentioned, I did recognize Madison Miller, who is another one of our senior capstone students. And as Morgan says, she is on her way to testify in Washington, D.C. About gun control and gun violence, particularly in schools. So she is missed tonight, but is doing very important work. So I think she's definitely excused for not being here. At this point, I would like to just have a quick recognition of the students. So if one more time you can have all of our pre-capstone students come on up. That is Elizabeth, Evangeline, Genevieve, and Caroline. I have flowers for you. And another big round of applause for them. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I'm so incredibly proud and blessed. And then for each of our senior capstone students, not only do you get flowers too, but they are also going to be super blinged out at graduation. Humanities combines 3 disciplines, and so they have 1 cord for each of the 3 disciplines. And we also have these lovely Enamel Academy pins that will go on those white sashes when you march at graduation this coming Sunday. So, Gabe, do you want to come on down first? There you go. And have record something at the end. Thank you. Next up, Hayden. Annalena. And Morgan. And now you have an opportunity for a fantastic group picture. How about one more round of applause for these amazing students? I hope you are all as impressed and as educated as I feel after listening to the research that all of these students have been embarking upon for the last year or two. And I hope that you will join us in the library, which is right across the hall. We have some refreshments provided by Frank's Bakery, so you know that they are sweet and delicious and fabulous. And we also have the research posters that each of these students created. So you'll have an opportunity to take a look at their research posters and ask questions and have conversations about their projects. And that's just right across the hall in the library. Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you're here, and thank you for being so amazing.